for the first part of this, I want to talk a little bit about just what is ecology, what do ecologists do, and how do they go about doing it. So it's going to be fairly general. And then for the second part, I want to just talk a little bit about a kind of special research program here at Konza, Prairie, which is replicated at other places around the country and around the world as an approach to doing ecology. So that's the thing. I'll give credit to, the scientific illustrations that I have in a couple of places on my slide come from a German zoologist, Ernst Haeckel. And you'll find the significance of Haeckel here in a few minutes. But he was an early naturalist. He was a zoologist and an embryologist and an artist. And he described a lot of species, and he provided these fabulous illustrations that I've used in the background. So first question is, what is ecology? What do ecologists do? And I always start off when I teach my class with this, because a lot of times people confuse ecology with a philosophy about how we relate to nature, or maybe about environmentalism. And I want to make the point that ecology is first of all, it's a scientific discipline. So I mean, first and foremost, ecology is a very broad scientific discipline. It's an interdisciplinary science. And what I mean by that is that ecologists pull together information from a lot of other branches of science. So if you heard Matt Kirk talk about geology and soils last week, I told my students, you need to know something about soils and minerals and nutrients to understand ecology. You also need to know something about, obviously, basic biology, genomics, climatology. We could go through a list. So it's very interdisciplinary and very integrated. That's one of the hallmarks of ecology. It has a focus, and the focus is on living organisms, but it's the interactions of living organisms. The focus on ecology is largely about connections. You can be a botanist, you can be a zoologist, you can be a microbiologist, and you're not necessarily an ecologist, although you're focused on those groups. But most ecologists focus on the interactions among organisms with each other and with their non-living or their abiotic environment, which we'll talk about. And again, the basic focus is on connections and trying to understand how organisms interact with one another and with their physical environment. I'll point out that ecology has gotten a lot of public attention since the 1960s and 70s, with the publication, for example, of Aldo Leopold's books, of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, First Earth Day. And that's raised a lot of awareness about the importance of ecology and its relationship to a lot of contemporary environmental issues. Climate change, obviously, is one of those. Acid rain would be another, ocean acidification. We could go through bunches of these. And all of those have a basis in understanding ecology, but ecology is not synonymous with environmentalism. And this has changed a lot in the last few decades, but once upon a time, if I would tell somebody I was an ecologist, they would ask, well, what organization do you belong to? Is it Nature Conservancy? Is it Greenpeace? Is it the Sierra Club? Do you recycle? And all of those are very, very good things that make you a better human being, but they don't necessarily make you an ecologist. So ecology provides the scientific background for addressing and understanding these questions. And many ecologists are also environmentalists or environmentally aware because they understand the importance of the issues and the processes underlying these problems. But the two things aren't exactly synonymous. What I would say is, though, ecology more and more is called upon to provide solutions to a lot of the environmental problems that we see. Okay, so what does the word ecology mean? Because that tells us a lot about actually what ecology. So this is where Ernst Haeckel comes in as well. This is another one of his illustrations. So the root of ecology is the word oikos. And so oikos means household. And there's a lot of ways of thinking about that, but one is that household means the place where organisms live and the things that they do. So ecologists
ecology basically started out as natural history, as describing where do you find organisms, what are they doing in those places, what is their function. So you can think about it as the study of the household in terms of study of habitat, the study of where organisms live. One of the things I think it's really interesting is that this is the same root for the word economics. Only economics means the management of the household. It focuses on managing budgets typically. Those two things are very much related because a lot of ecology also focuses on managing budgets, whether it's numbers of individuals in population ecology, or it's managing nutrient budgets in ecosystems ecology. So there's a clear link between those two. So Ernst Haeckel, again, is the German zoologist that coined the word ecology, and this is what he had to say about it. He said, by ecology, we mean the body of knowledge concerning the economy of nature. So there's the link between economy and ecology, again, with that same root word. And then he went on to say a few things, and he said, it's the investigation of the total relations of the animal. He could have said organism, but he's a zoologist. Total relations of the animal, both to its living and non-living environment. Okay, so that's important because it makes the point that organisms not only interact with one another, they interact with the physical environment. And then he said, in a word, ecology is the study of all the complex interrelationships. So again, it's about studying the connections referred to by Darwin as the conditions of the struggle for existence. I think that's important too, because there's a very strong link between ecology and evolution. And when we study organisms and the environment, it's always in the context of how they've evolved. You know, what is their adaptations to the environment that they live in and the organisms that they interact with. So I'm going to go through a couple of definitions of ecology quickly, because again, this kind of tells you what ecologists are thinking about over time and what they do. And it turns out that how ecology is defined has changed as the science has matured. So back in the 1920s, I would say that ecology was largely scientific natural history. It was describing where species occur and what they do. So it was, the emphasis was very descriptive. In the 50s, that changed to focus on population dynamics and population ecology. A lot of ecology was concerned with where species occur, and are they growing, are they declining, what controls their numbers over time. In the 1970s, again, this is kind of with Earth Day and a little better understanding of the interaction between humans and their environment, it became the study of the structure and function of nature more broadly. And the emphasis switched from looking at just populations by themselves to the interactions of organisms. And then where are we at now? I don't think the definition of ecology has really changed much in the last couple of decades, but one of the things that has changed is the emphasis. I think there's a much bigger emphasis on solving problems than there has been in the past. Much of ecology historically has been what I would call basic ecology, which was focused on advancing the science. Yeah, no, that's a great question. If you didn't hear the question was, there's been an emphasis in ecology on monetizing, on putting an economic value on ecological services. And is that related to this idea of making ecology more relevant, trying to figure out what it's worth in terms of dollar values? I'd say yes, it is. I mean, that was one approach, is this ecological economics, putting, what's the value of all of the pollinator services in the US or in the world, and what's their value in terms of sequestering carbon from the atmosphere. There are mixed feelings about whether that was a good idea or not. In one sense, it does really emphasize the value of ecosystem goods and services and puts a dollar amount on it, which is in the billions or trillions of dollars, depending on the scale that we're talking about. And so a lot of people who might not be interested in nature per se are interested in economics. So that's been good in that regard. There's some people that have pushed back on that idea, though, because it does put everything into the context of dollar amounts. And there is some, for a lot of people, there's an intrinsic value in being in nature, being in a natural setting, intrinsic value in biodiversity that you shouldn't put a dollar on. So there are mixed feelings about how appropriate that approach has been. But you're absolutely right. That grew out of the idea that we could make people more aware of how important ecological processes are to their everyday lives if we put dollar values on that. One other thing I'd point out is when I became a graduate student and I decided I wanted to do ecology as a profession, I did not want to be an applied ecologist. I did not want to work on problem solving. I was an entomologist initially. I worked with insects, and I did not want to be a spray and pray entomologist. I didn't want to do insect control. I really was interested in just bugs and fascinated by how they interacted with one another and with their environment in nature. And I had a real strong knee-jerk reaction to applied ecology. I could see its value, but it's not something I wanted to do. I think a lot of ecologists, a lot of students coming up today are exactly the opposite. And I think the reason is that there are so many environmental issues that are just critical for our long-term well-being that most students that I talk to these days, even regardless of what they're studying, are looking for solutions. They might be doing basic fundamental science, but they're thinking about how do I apply that scientific knowledge to solve real world problems. And that's, I think, one of the big changes that's happened in the last decade or so. No, that's a really good question. So Nora was pointing out that the funding agencies have also changed over time, so that even funding agencies that fund basic science are interested in the broader impacts and how these research results apply to problems. And that does drive the science to some extent too. But we had a kind of open forum at several society meetings a couple years ago. And what are the cutting edge questions in ecosystem science? Where is ecosystem science going? And what amazed me was virtually all of the young people that stood up talked about how we must move beyond just understanding to solving problems. And I get the sense it was driven by more than just what's available to support my funding. It was really a sincere desire to try to help fix things. There's really long, complex definitions of ecology. This is the simple one I tell my students, and they can remember this for a test, right? It's the study of the interactions of organisms with their physical environment and with each other. And I put up this little slide to point out, when we think about the environment, oftentimes we think about the physical world. That's the environment, right? So it's the non-living part. It's the soil, the water, the mineral nutrients, the light available. That's the physical environment, and then organisms live in that environment, right? But for an organism, its environment also includes the other organisms around it. You know, if you're a plant, you're competing with other plants around you. You might be dealing with something that wants to eat you. You're dealing with disease organisms. And so there's a biotic environment as well that includes competitors, predators, prey, mates, so on. And then another really important point is that organisms don't only respond to their environment, they change it. It's a two-way interaction. And I like to point out that when we think about the Earth's climate, based on the distance of our planet from the sun, we should be a frozen ball. We're close enough that our temperature would be on average below zero. But the Earth isn't that way at all. And the reason it's not that way is that our atmosphere has a lot of radiatively active gases that are produced by living organisms. In fact, there's no reason that our Earth should even have an oxygen atmosphere. Our whole planet should have a different redox potential if it weren't for living organisms. So living organisms at a global scale have changed the atmosphere of the planet, but they do things at smaller scales as well. So these two-way interactions are really important, and I think that's one of the fascinating aspects of ecology. So you might remember from basic biology, you have this, this hierarchy in biology where we have, okay, there are cells, and a bunch of cells that are similar, doing similar things we call tissue. And then a bunch of tissues that lump together we call organs, and then organs lumped together doing a similar function we call organ systems, right? Well, this is the level of biology for most ecologists. So we can start with thinking about the individual organism, which actually surprisingly is sometimes hard to define. For example, when we go out into the prairie and we find a patch of goldenrod, a large patch in the middle of these grasslands, those might all be genetically identical clones of one another. So what is the individual? Is it the individual stem and tiller that we see, or is it that patch that's the genetic individual? But we have individual organisms, and then we have groups of those individual organisms of the same species occurring in the same place at the same time, and that's what we mean by a population. So these are milkweed bugs. There's a small population of milkweed bugs on a plant. Then we go to a larger scale. All of the populations in a given area, regardless of whether they're insects or plants or microbes, the broad definition of community is just all of the populations in a given area is a community. So when we think about the grassland community, in a broad sense, it includes every living thing that's there, whether it's a microbe, a plant, a bird, small mammal. A lot of times we talk about those separately. If I'm a bird ecologist, I'll talk about the avian community or the birdie community. But in reality, that's just part of a larger community. And then the ecosystem represents, it's a community. So it's all the organisms in a given area with their physical environment. So I'll talk a little bit more about the ecosystem in a second, because that's a really important concept. Biomes are a layer higher yet. And what biomes are is they're regional systems that have very similar vegetation and climate. So this is a map of grassland biomes around the world. Now, you can have a grassland in Australia, a grassland in Africa, a grassland in North America that have completely different species. They might have no species at all in common, but they're part of the same biome because they have the same climate and the same dominant vegetation type. And then all of the biomes, all of the ecosystems of the world linked together forms the biosphere, right? One of the things that's really cool about the biosphere, so it includes all the living organisms and the physical environment in which they live. If you scale the Earth up to the size of an apple, the entire biosphere, the depth of the deepest soils and sediments where we know microbes live, to the top of the troposphere where there are microbes floating around, would be about the thickness of the apple skin. So that little peel around the apple, or that little skin around the planet, that's our layer of life. That's the entire biosphere. So each of these levels then is something that ecologists study. And I told you what they are, so I can go through these quickly, and you've got them written down. But again, a population is all the individuals of a single species in a particular place. And what's important about that too is that they're capable of interbreeding. If they're the same species and they're in the same place, they are a genetic unit. So we can study them in terms of their genetics and their evolution as well. That's why it's a basic unit of ecology from an evolutionary perspective. Community then, again, is all the populations in a given area. An ecosystem is the community and its physical environment together. And then biome is this large regional ecosystem or ecological system. It's characterized by the type of vegetation and its climate. There's only about 12 biomes that people recognize, right? There's tons of different ecosystems, but we can recognize deserts, grasslands, temperate forests, tropical forests, savannas. I mean, there are a limited number of actually biomes that we talk about. And then there's this biosphere again, which is a hard thing to study because we can't do traditional experiments at the biosphere level. There's no replication yet. I'm working on Mars, but we have one planet, right? And so we use different approaches when we study when we do global ecology, when we try to study processes at the global scale. We have to pull together information from other smaller experiments, but then we link them together with models. And I'll talk about that in a second. I do want to spend a minute talking about ecosystems, because I'm an ecosystems ecologist. That's basically the level I tend to work at. And this was a concept that's relatively new. And it had really important ramifications for how we think about ecology and how the world works. This guy, Arthur Tansley, became knighted later, so he's Sir Arthur Tansley. He was a botanist, an English botanist, and he did a lot of things. One of the things he did was he founded the first ecological society, the first professional society for ecologists in the world.
and it was the British Ecological Society. He founded one of the first ecological journals called New Phytologist, and it's a real cool journal. And he coined the term ecosystem. And although there were a lot of Russian scientists and others that had been thinking about how living and non-living systems are linked together, thinking about how living and non-living systems basically form a whole unit, it hadn't been formalized. And what Tansley said was, again, he was a botanist. He was interested in plants. He said, although organisms may claim our prime interest, I'm out there looking at plants. When we try to think fundamentally, we can't separate them from the environments in which they live, in which they form one physical system. So he took some ideas that, again, came from the early ideas about a biosphere, and Vernadsky had, a Russian geologist had these ideas about one living system. But now it became, we have to think about living and non-living organisms as a unit, as a system. And this was kind of controversial at the time. It was a really new idea, thinking about them as integrated. And then this guy took it to the whole next level. This is Gene Odom. I did my PhD at the University of Georgia. And Gene Odom and his brother Howard were both ecologists, and they were working in the 1950s. Ecology was still kind of looked down upon as natural history, right? It wasn't a rigorous science. And Gene got mad about that and decided to change it. So he wrote a textbook called Fundamentals of Ecology in the 1950s, which trained generations of ecologists. And he organized the whole textbook around the concept of an ecosystem, which was a completely different approach from other textbooks that focused on populations first and then built up from there. He started with the ecosystem as the basic unit in nature, and then we'll break it down into communities and populations and its parts. And he said a whole bunch of things. He said you have to look at ecosystems because the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And what he meant by that is you have to study how whole systems function to understand those systems. If you break them up into their parts and just study the individual pieces, you'll never understand the behavior of the entire system. It's a philosophy called holism, and he was a big proponent of this. Anyway, so he defined the ecosystem as any unit in nature that includes all organisms in a given area and their abiotic environment, living organisms in their environment, interacting so that energy flows lead to biotic structure and material cycles. And that's important because the energy flows means that he was thinking about energy from the sun as the source of energy that drives the whole biosphere. And plants capture that in photosynthesis, but he could quantify, and scientists could quantify the rate at which that energy from the sun, the energy in photons and light, gets converted to chemical energy in the plant. And then you could quantify the rate at which that energy is eaten by herbivores and eaten by their predators, and you could follow energy movement through ecosystems. That's pretty cool. And then that energy flow leads to food webs, okay, which is biotic structure. And then nutrients, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, move through these ecosystems along with that energy. So it was a way of applying some concepts from physics and other what were considered hard disciplines to understanding ecological systems. So ecosystems, and I like the idea that he defined them as any unit in nature. So an ecosystem could be a pond, it could be a rotting log, or it could be the whole planet, right? It's all dependent on the questions you're asking. I'll point out too, like for the tallgrass prairie, somebody asked me to point out where is the tallgrass prairie ecosystem. I have trouble with that because I don't think there's a single tallgrass prairie ecosystem. I don't think about ecosystems that way. I think about there are patches of tallgrass prairie which are ecosystems in themselves. They may or may not be connected to other patches of tallgrass prairie, depending on this, whether it's agricultural fields or cities between them. So I think about the ecosystem when I walk out to Konza, I think about the ecosystem as the square meter or the watershed that I'm studying at that time, and the things that I can measure, and then I can scale those up. So if I know the productivity on this watershed is, we just say 450 grams of biomass per year is produced on this prairie,
That's an ecosystem measurement that I can say applies to a lot of other tallgrass prairies. But the unit that I'm studying is really user defined, and that's true for a lot of ecosystems that ecologists study. So based on these levels of ecology, ecology and ecologists are often broken up into what do they study. And so I just want to talk a little bit about the kind of questions that people would study at different levels. So if I'm an ecologist interested mostly in organisms, what I would be doing is probably called physiological ecology. Okay, it's also sometimes called ecophysiology. But the idea here is that the focus is on the individual organism and how it responds to the physical environment. So for example, this is Jesse Nippert, who you're going to hear from. Jesse's going to talk about climate here in a week or two, I think a couple of weeks. But Jesse's out there with a device that measures photosynthetic rate of the grasses. How fast are they capturing carbon dioxide? And so that kind of question, how does the photosynthetic rate of this big blue stem plant change depending on if it's in full sunlight or clouds or underneath a canopy? That's a physiological ecology question, because it's how does this organism respond to a change in the physical environment? And if I'm interested in the fish that live in the streams around here, I might ask, how does stream water temperature affect the respiration rate of this little southern red-bellied dace here? And that would be physiological ecology, because my focus is on the organism.
So is it in the organism or in the population?
No, at this level, it really is the organism. It's understanding how this particular, you might say, how does any individual of red-bellied dace respond to this? But if I'm thinking about how an individual changes its physiology or its behavior in response to an environmental variation, we start with the organism level first. Now I will tell you that I'm presenting all these as if they're clean categories. You work at one level or another. Many ecologists work across levels. So what you might do is ask a question about how does this fish respond to stream water temperature? But then I might ask, well, how does that affect the ability of this fish to reproduce? And then that feeds into how does the population change? So you're absolutely right. But ecologists, if you ask an ecologist who works at this level what they do, they'll probably say that they're a physiological ecologist or an ecophysiologist.
So that's kind of the butterfly effect.
Yeah, right. The things cascade. Exactly. Yeah, and so this is the questions you would ask are going to be a little different. So at the population level, we might ask, how does temperature influence the reproductive rate, and how does that influence population growth of that red-bellied dace? Or how do birth rates and death rates of deer mice from year to year affect their density in the prairie, right? And so we would want to quantify what is their birth rate and death rate. We might ask questions about, is that affected by temperature, by food availability, or for grasses? One of the things you'll learn about many of our perennial grasses here is that they can reproduce by seed, but they also reproduce asexually by tillering with these underground rhizomes. And so we might ask, is seed production or is tillering more important for predicting big blue stem populations from year to year? And that would be a population level question because we're thinking about numbers of individuals per unit area. Oops. Let me try.
Can I ask a question?
You can.
I mean, as you're talking about that, I'm thinking it would be ridiculous to practice at just the organism level, because so what? Like if it's metabolic rate changes, it only matters to a biologist if it impacts survival and reproduction, right? So you're automatically going to looking at the population.
So yes. So one way of making sense of studying at these different levels is there's another philosophy in science called moderate reductionism. And what that philosophy says is that you study something at the level of interest for the questions you're asking. So that the question you're asking is about the metabolic rate of the fish. You might study the fish at that level. To understand why that's important, you would look at the levels above to put it into that context, right? So why is this important? Yeah, the most important thing, immediate thing would be it probably affects the survivorship of that particular individual. And the survivorship of that individual, assuming that temperature survivorship relationship applies to those fish in general, then affects the population density. So that's at the next level. And then you could ask, well, that population density, how do those particular fish affect the stream communities that they live in? And a community ecologist would then say, well, an ecologist would say, well, okay, what do changes in that stream community mean for ecosystem processes within that stream, for energy capture and nutrient cycling? So you do work across those scales, but a lot of times a particular lab or a particular group of people are focusing on one level, but it's the answers that they are looking for apply across many levels. That's a good point. Thanks for pointing that out. At the ecosystem level, at the community level, usually we're interested now in groups of species. So one important aspect of communities is their biodiversity. And that's something that a lot of ecologists are interested in. So how do interacting communities alter species interactions? Like, for example, how do bison grazing in the prairie alter competition among the plant species where they're feeding? And so if they preferentially feed on grasses, for example, are they releasing the forbs, the rarer species, from competition in ways that allow those forbs to increase in their population density? How do those changes affect the overall diversity of the prairie? So those are community questions because they're not focused on a single population now, but you're focused on groups of populations interacting together. And then at the ecosystem level, we really don't tend to focus on species as much. We focus on common currency that all ecosystems share. So for example, we focus on transformations of movement, energy, biomass, nutrients, and water among living and non-living components of the ecosystem. So the kind of questions here might be, what controls carbon dioxide uptake or carbon dioxide exchange between a grassland in the atmosphere or a forest in the atmosphere? Where is the carbon in a forest or grassland stored? We're lumping together lots of species that store carbon. We're not focused as much on biodiversity. We recognize, of course, biodiversity matters, the composition of the community matters, but we're thinking about the whole system and how does it function. Would warmer temperatures, with climate change the movement of water through a forest in ways that might reduce, for example, groundwater flux or stream flow? And that would be kind of that would be an ecosystem question. Okay, so all of these things that we measure at the ecosystem scale, when you aggregate them together, this is what controls global biology, global ecology. So, at the global level, we think about the whole Earth system, okay, the biosphere, this life support system on the planet, right? All of the plants and animals that are here, everything that supports them. And we can ask really big questions like, how do changes in land use globally influence atmospheric chemistry? How much do they contribute to the greenhouse effect, for example? How much of the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere comes from burning fossil fuels? How much comes from cutting down tropical forests or plowing grasslands or building cities and other land use changes? We can partition those things at the global scale. Or, that you can ask questions about connections at really large scales. So like these dust storms that are leaving sub-Saharan Africa and moving west, what effect do those have on productivity of tropical forests in South America? Turns out a lot. Turns out that tropical forests in South America are very phosphorus limited because of the highly weathered soils they grow on. And the inputs of phosphorus and iron from these dust storms actually can fertilize those forests or can fertilize parts of the open ocean in ways that change productivity. So those are the kind of questions you might ask at global scales. And you use different tools, right? Because we can't do traditional experiments, but we can use satellite imagery and remotely collected data. We can use models where if we understand global circulation patterns, we can look at how that changes the distribution of materials around the planet. I put this graph in here because this is something I use in a lot of my classes too. That's the radiation balance for the whole planet on average. And that's what determines the greenhouse effect. And if you understand the greenhouse effect, then we can talk about why certain gases in the atmosphere are increasing the temperature of the planet. And I think it's important that, all of my students, I think it's important everybody knows that, but that's something that I spend a little bit of time on as well. So those are questions at the global level. I can go just really quickly through. So I want to point out that ecologists don't just make this stuff up. The way that we learn stuff, the way that the information in our ecology textbooks comes from basically 3 different approaches. That's observations, experiments, and models. And when we do experiments, we can do them in the lab. Ecologists actually do work in the lab as well as in the field. And I want to point out a couple of things. When I say observation, a lot of times people think about somebody going out with a notebook and binoculars, and that's perfectly valid. That's a great way to go out and do some bird studies. I mean, there are things you can do with a pencil and a notebook. But just because you're doing observational studies doesn't mean it's simple. And so here are 2 examples of an observational study. All an observational study means is that you're not doing any manipulations. You're observing what's happening under natural conditions. So for example, in this flex tower here, we're measuring the exchange of carbon dioxide and energy between the grassland and the atmosphere. That is an observational study, even though it's high tech, right? We could do observational studies with satellites. You can collect DNA from a stream, and you can analyze that DNA and determine what species are present there by looking at the environmental DNA. Now, you're not doing an experiment, you're not manipulating anything, but you're using high-tech tools to do observations, right? So observations don't mean simple, they just mean we're not doing an experiment, but we can get a lot of good information. Experiments, I think everybody knows the kind of traditional experiment diagram where we start with an observation at the top, like the things we were just doing. We come up with a hypothesis from our observations. From that hypothesis, we can make some testable predictions. And then so we design an experiment. We run the experiment. We either reject or don't reject our hypothesis. And then we can move on from there. We can design more experiments to further test that hypothesis, or if we reject our hypothesis, we go back and we think about new hypotheses and new ideas about what's happening, right? The reason I want to put this up here, though, it's really important that I think people in the general public they forget about this sometimes. Science is a self-correcting process because of this. If you have a hypothesis, your pet favorite hypothesis, that is not supported by the experimental results that you run, you need to think deeply about that, and you need to reject that idea or refine that idea or come up with new experiments. And that's, again, that's a really important thing. It's much different than a belief system. It forces you to constantly reevaluate what you think you know about how the world works. And that's a hallmark of any good science, not just ecology. I'll just point out that, again, with experiments, we can do them in the lab or greenhouse. There are lots of ways of asking ecological questions in that setting, but a lot of field experiments are done, or a lot of experiments are done in the field too. You can ask yourself, what are the advantages or disadvantages of these approaches, right? And you could probably come up with some ideas about that. The advantages of doing things in the greenhouse or in the lab. You're dealing with very simplified systems where you often define the organisms that you have and their density. You can make things very uniform as far as the environmental conditions so that you can have greater control over the processes you're trying to measure. And there's a lot of good basic ecology that's done that way. But the question is, how does that apply to the field? How does that apply to a real world situation? And so experiments in the field let you test some of the ideas that are generated in the lab. But in the field, the disadvantages, the trade-offs is that there are lots of other factors you can't control, which can affect the outcome of your experiments. And you always wonder about these confounding factors and how best to control for them. So there are benefits and trade-offs to both of these approaches, and they're complementary to one another. And I won't say much about models at all, except to point out that what is a model? I loved building model cars and airplanes, right, when I was a kid. And none of them flew or drove, right? but they were representations of something in the real world that did fly or drive. You know, you could drive, and they had a lot of the parts that were critical. Airplanes had wings. They had little propellers. They had a little cockpit. You know, the cars had tires. They might have even had a little plastic engine in there. They represented something that was real. And models in science should be the same way. They're not meant to replicate all the complexities and all of the pieces of nature, but they're meant to represent something important that has many of the features of the system that you're interested in. So they're simplifications of some real world thing that lets you more easily work with and manipulate it. So there are lots of different kinds of models. The population model that I put up here, the little math equation at the end, that's a simple math equation that lets you predict population growth in the population size in the future, if you know the population's growth rate and the starting size. Now, is that realistic in terms of what happens in nature? Probably not, because conditions change left and right, but it's a framework for how populations would grow if everything was constant. And this is a model of energy flow through an ecosystem. And this has no numbers on it, but it tells us conceptually, if an organism eats a certain amount of calories, some of it's assimilated, some of it's not. Of the energy that's assimilated, some of it is respired away, and some of it goes into biomass. And then models let us do things that we wouldn't be able to do experimentally. So when we talk about global change models and predicting future climates, we take the information that we know about the Earth's climate system, and we use parameters that we think are going to change in the future, like concentrations of carbon dioxide, and we can make predictions by using these models about what future climates might be. So modeling at the global level is really important. Let me take a short intermission. I wanted to talk a little bit about Konza Prairie and a broader program on ecological research. So, research at Konza Prairie, research in Kansas in general, focuses a lot on grasslands. Okay, we live in the grassland biome, actually. Well, we're going to take that back a little bit. If you paid attention to Matt Kirk's talk, and I think Jill's talk, you will know that there's a very strong precipitation gradient in Kansas that goes from really wet at the east and southeast ends to really dry at the western end. At the eastern portion of the state, we're really in the transition zone, which is also called an ecotone, which would be a great name for a band, by the way. But an ecotone is actually a transition zone between communities or ecosystems. So the eastern part of the state is the transition between the deciduous forest biome and the grassland biome. But most of Kansas is part of the grassland biome. Why do we care about grasslands? Well, globally, so thinking about these global issues, grasslands cover, grasslands and other herbaceous dominated systems like tundras, which don't have trees, cover 30 to 40% of the Earth's terrestrial surface. So they're really important in terms of things like carbon exchange and nutrient cycling. And they're very productive areas in terms of conversion to agricultural activities. The other thing about grasslands that's important from an ecological and conservation perspective is that temperate grasslands, like Konza and the grasslands in Kansas, are among the most endangered types of ecosystems in the world. And you might know that tropical forests and temperate rainforests are threatened ecosystems. But this was published in 2005, and they took all of these different ecosystem types, so temperate grasslands and savannas that are at top, tropical forests are a little lower down, but they looked at what proportion of the area in those different ecosystem types is conserved, which is the white bars, and how much of it has already been converted. So in other words, how much of it has been changed already and how much is set aside and protected. And temperate grasslands ended up with the greatest risk index based on that. And the reason is much of the temperate grasslands around the world have been converted primarily for agricultural activities. And temperate grasslands don't have a lot of conservation area. And think about how much of Kansas is set aside for conservation, right? And that's true of most temperate grasslands around the world. So they're both important ecologically, and they're at high risk. And think about the tall grass prairies. So in North America, tall grass prairies covered, I think, roughly 76 million hectares, a big area in North America that ranged from, parts of Ohio, where I grew up, by the way. I grew up in the eastern deciduous biome, into Canada, down into Texas. And about 5% or so of that remains now, right? Most of it's already been converted. And the biggest remaining areas are here in the Flint Hills, where Konza is. So I don't know how you may all already know this, so I'll go through this quickly. But so Konza is jointly owned by Kansas State University and the Nature Conservancy, and it was established in 1971 as a biological field research station. It's managed by the Division of Biology, and it's dedicated to this threefold mission of research, conservation, and education. Konza is, a lot of people think about Konza based on our nature trail and a place to walk. It's a nice place to come out and enjoy nature. But the first thing I tell people, it's an outdoor laboratory. And so we used to be able to tell, the VPR on campus, our vice president for research, that we have the largest laboratory in the university because we measure ours in square miles instead of square feet. But it is first and foremost a place to do ecology. So it's a large outdoor laboratory. It is open to researchers from anywhere. And that's one of my jobs as the director, is so people will write a research grant, or they'll have a student project and they'll apply to do research here. Sometimes they'll contact me in advance, sometimes they'll just file a permit online, but then it's my job to make sure that their research doesn't interfere with other research that's going on here, that it all fits together. And so we host graduate students, undergraduate students, and professional scientists, literally from institutions around the world, to come here to do research. Last year with COVID, we didn't have a whole lot of on-site researchers, but things are going to open up this year, and we'll start to have people coming back. I've already had contact from people on the East Coast, people in the Northern Plains. I haven't had any international visitors yet, but I expect that we'll have a lot of research scientists coming back again this summer to continue their projects. And they work at all the levels I talked about. So they ask questions at all of these levels. The other thing that Konza is because we have so much instrumentation and collection of data here, that we serve as a benchmark for measuring environmental change. And if we go walking here in a few minutes, we can walk by a couple of these sites that are part of national networks that try to measure the same things in the same way at lots of sites around the country or around the world in some cases, and to quantify changes in the atmospheric chemistry or the chemistry of rainfall. So we belong to a lot of these networks, and I can talk about a couple of them if you'd like. There's the National Atmospheric Deposition Program, that's rainfall chemistry. Clean Air Standards and Trends Network, that's the ozone level. Yes?
I'm sorry to interrupt you. We have a question about a previous slide that I missed in the chat. So finish your thought and then I will ask that.
Yeah, okay. So there's just a lot of, there are networks on site that help us measure global change. There's a coordinated network called the Climate Reference Network that measures basic climate parameters in the same way all around the country so that we have a standardized measurement of the current climate and how it's changing, for example.
Can you tell us about that thing up there, please?
Yeah, so I stole this slide. So I stole this slide from Dave Hartnett.
Okay.
Dave Hartnett put that in there. It's a benchmark. It literally is so he was trying to make the point. So that is a physical benchmark that you would use for marking a location in a landscape.
David asked a question about the conversion
of
prairies
yes.
of temperate grasslands, and he wanted to know if this conversion is due to human activity or anything like tundra monkey.
Oh, no, that's a great question. So most, in the temperate grasslands, by far the major factor is human activity. It's mostly conversion to agricultural activities. But then if you look at a place like Chicago, for example, the urbanization and suburbanization and ranchettes, all of that plays a major role. I'm trying to think if there are other grasslands that have been more directly impacted by, for example, regional climate changes. There might be some arid grasslands in places like sub-Saharan Africa and the southwestern United States, where it's a combination of human activity and climate change that have resulted in a shift from, for example, from desert grasslands to desert shrublands or to true deserts. So it's a combination of both. But I think when we think about things like the thawing of the Arctic, the thawing of the tundra, that's a very indirect effect of human activity, but it's driven by climate. In most temperate grasslands, I would argue that the biggest effect has been plowing. It's been directly human related. So one of the difficulties with studying long-term changes that might be related to human activity or to climate change is that you need long-term data sets to do that. You need data sets that span decades. And up until the 1980s, there was no program in the United States that funded long-term ecological research. So the way research gets done, research costs money. Costs money. So for example, if I have a graduate student, to support a graduate student with fringe and everything, that's $40,000 a year. Okay, for one student per year. If I have lab work that's going to be done, I have to pay for the reagents and the sample analysis and the chemistry. If I want to put sensors in the field, it might cost me $5,000 to set up a data logger and some sensors. It takes money. Where does that come from? It does not come from the university. The university does not fund our research. So as scientists, we have to write grants. We go to the National Science Foundation or the USDA or the Department of Energy, and we'll write a proposal to fund our research. And it gets reviewed against a lot of other proposals. It's a very competitive process. At the National Science Foundation and the programs I apply to, funding rates are often about 6%. So 94% of the proposals that get submitted don't get funded, okay? So you have to write a good proposal. You have to be fortunate enough to get it funded. And then those grants typically would run for 2 or 3, maybe 4 years at the most. So you do a study that lasts for a few years, and then you may or may not get refunded again. So how do we address questions like climate change that's going to happen over decades? Or study processes that you don't capture in those 3 or 4 years? The National Science Foundation realized this was a problem in the 1970s, and they started having discussions. And in the 1980s, they started a brand new funding program called the Long-Term Ecological Research Network, or LTER. And this was unique because now the funding didn't go to a particular scientist per se. It went to a research site. It had to be led by scientists at the site, but the funding was tied to a location and not a person. And it was designed to go over decades. So Konza Prairie was selected as one of the very first LTER sites in 1980 when the funding program first started. There were only 6 initial sites funded. It was kind of an experiment and a trial. And it's been hugely successful. So now the National Science Foundation funds up to 28 of these LTER sites. Some have been dropped over time, and some have been added, but there are currently 28 that cover lots of different biomes and lots of different ecosystem types. They're funded in 6-year increments, so longer than a normal grant, and they're subject to renewal. So we are now at Konza Prairie, we're in our 8th funding cycle. And so now we have decades, literally 4 decades of data on how the grassland is changing. And we can ask and answer questions we would never have been able to do without this kind of data. So this was a really important program in terms of advancing the ecology within the United States. And it's been now mirrored by countries around the world. There's an international LTER network that focuses on the same kind of long-term research. So what do? All the LTR sites, they all measure things in sites, a little tricky sometimes. Common level ecology that we're kind of talking about. Primary productivity, that's how much energy is captured by plants, how much do they grow every year. That's an ecosystem process. Spatial and temporal dynamics of populations and communities. What species are out there and how are they changing over time? How much organic matter is stored? That's another ecosystem question, and so is nutrient dynamics. This was started as kind of an ecosystem program. And then how do organisms or communities or populations or ecosystems respond to disturbance? That's a question that cuts across all these levels. So all the LTR sites measure this in some way, right? So at Konza, the research here in this grassland focuses on the three major things that make this grassland what it is, and that's fire, grazing, and climate variability. So how do we do that? When the site was established, Konza was established, it was set up so that there are different watersheds, different units on the landscape, which have different fire and grazing treatments. So this is our laboratory, Konza. Well, we have treatments that we apply in different portions of the laboratory to study the effects of fire and grazing. So there are some, does everybody here know this yet?
A little bit.
So
The ones that went out with me know the watershed names-ish.
yeah, so the basic idea here was we know that fire and grazing are important in tallgrass prairie. How do we study them? Well, you want to have treatments. So we have some watersheds that have no grazing at all. We have other watersheds that are grazed by bison and other watersheds that are grazed by cattle. So by comparing the non-grazed watersheds with those that are grazed by bison or grazed by cattle, we can ask how do bison, how do cattle affect the diversity of the communities, the species that are there, or other ecological processes. We also know that fire is important. Well, we want to have different levels of treatment for fire then. So some of our watersheds are burned every year. Some of them are burned every 2 years, every 4 years, every 20 years. So we can look at how do different levels of fire affect these grasslands as well. I might be running out of battery. In addition to these big watersheds, and I should mention, on all these watersheds, we have permanent measuring points where we've been measuring things literally for decades. So we have these long-term databases, and we can look for directional changes over time. In addition to that, we measure water chemistry. So we have stream water sampling points, groundwater sampling points, and then we have lots of small-scale experiments. So the kind of field experiments that I talked about, these are experimental streams. They look like wading pools connected together with troughs. Those are representations of our real stream systems. The troughs represent riffles, the pools represent the deeper pools in the streams, and then we can manipulate the fish populations and see how the algal populations respond to that, for example. We have other experiments, some of them we're going to look at if we walk around headquarters here, that are designed to ask other questions at different levels. So I just want to point out that Konza is unique in that it's an experimental grassland where we ask a lot of ecological questions at different scales, but it's also part of these national networks that are asking larger scale ecological questions. And the reasons I think that is important is because a lot of the environmental issues that we're very, very concerned about today, global warming, habitat fragmentation, changes in land use, to address and solve these environmental problems requires long-term data. And that's one of the things that we can effectively do as a biological station like this. So we do a lot of different things. We do basic ecology. So we test ecological ideas like what's the relationship between species diversity and community stability? Are diverse communities really more stable than non-diverse communities? That's actually a controversial issue. Are diverse communities more productive? Well, it depends. So we ask some really basic ecological questions that are related to ecological theory, but we also want to understand the consequences of global change and be able to predict what will happen, what will Kansas grasslands look like in 25 years if we do, well, let's go further than that. Let's go out to 2050. That's a benchmark for atmospheric chemistry and CO2 levels we're shooting for. What will Kansas grasslands look like if we do nothing to change the trajectory of climate change? Will they be more or less productive? Will we lose species? And that's the kind of information that you need, I think, for dealing with these issues and for developing management strategies that will be ultimately more effective at conserving our resources. So I'm happy to answer more questions, talk about anything and all things ecology you want to talk about. We can go for a walk and we can look at some of the places on Konza too.